Imagine, I want you to use your imagination now. We're going to the 16th century, around 1580. We're going to Ireland, to Dublin, and we're going to a small village that has grown attached to the city of Dublin. And over there, you have a guy called Patrick Johnson. I'm just making up a name. Patrick Johnson. Mr. Johnson, he was 17 years old. He grew up in the community. And this guy was always open about his emotions. He was not bothering people or anything, but he was just open with his emotions, and he was very close and intimate in speech. And he was just himself. Okay? Now, at the time, Ireland was governed by the government of England. And this led to exploitation of the Irish population. And people were dissatisfied with it. But that's just the circumstance of the country. I'll explain later why I've mentioned it. Okay. So, Johnson, he's 17 years old, and there is some argument in town, and Johnson is not involved, so he's just ignoring the argument. He passes on. And when he became 18, 19, and people just noticed that he does not bother at all with the conflicts around him. So people began to, they began to wonder why he's not into all that likes and dislikes. Because you had one people not liking other people, and also the same people were not liked by other people, so I had these dislikes going on and on. Johnson did not participate in it. Instead, Johnson went to the harbor, he had a job, and he was saving money. So, when Johnson was 20, there were people that began to accuse him, that he thinks he's everything and all of that. And Johnson simply made plain that if they choose to feel bad concerning him, that's their problem. He doesn't care at all. And he kept on doing his thing. He simply refused to entertain accusation. But his attitude to his rejection of the accusation and his refusal to give in to the allegations, it enraged many people. Because if Johnson would have defended himself, then they could have started an argument. But now they couldn't start an argument because he just didn't give in. So we would think it would stop over there. No. The people kept on gossiping and murmuring about him behind his back. And again, Johnson did not care. People began to fabricate all kinds of rumors that had no basis in reality. But while they were doing that, Johnson prospered. And when Johnson was 24, he married. And 1 year after he was married, he paid some construction workers to build a large house for him. A big house. But the people in town were not aware of his plans. He just did his thing. So, and when he was 25, and people saw that big house, they saw Johnson coming out of the house with the keys. And they were thinking, what's going on here? Johnson made clear, this is my house. Now, what happened now? All those people that turned their dislikes upon Johnson, they began to view him as bad, treat him as crap. They now were faced with their own bitterness. Why? Because they were hoping things would go bad with him, so they would have some excuse for their violence against him, because their dislike is just pure violence. Even though they did not touch him physically, it was still violence. Now they couldn't come up with an excuse for their violence, so their pain increased because now they had to face his prosperity, and the hurt within all those people grew and grew. Some people even began to scream at Johnson, act out against Johnson, saying that he thinks he's everything because he has a big house, blah, blah, blah. Johnson just didn't care. And there were times he even, he hired construction workers to renovate the house. And some of those construction workers would deal with the people that tried to throw eggs or anything to his house, because the kids of those people also began to dislike Johnson. Johnson had 14 kids with his wife. He was in his 40s towards his 50s now. And the people around, since the time he was 17, they also grew up. All that pain they had towards him, it was not the fault of Johnson, it was their own. That pain, that dissatisfaction, man, it grew, and it also affected their children. Many of them, without being aware of it, they acted out that dissatisfaction that they had towards Johnson upon their own children. So their children also grew up with bitterness. But the children didn't realize that the bitterness came from their parents. They heard them that people were speaking bad about Johnson all the time. So they became infected also with this, Johnson mania. I'm just making up a name, this groundless rage against Johnson. This rage also affected the children of Johnson. One of the children of Johnson was a young woman called Celine. So Celine felt the hostility was growing, and she sensed that soon something bad was about to happen, and she moved out of town. She crossed the Irish Sea and moved to England. The rest of her siblings remained over there. Her parents also. And I'm used to making male examples, so I was confused a few seconds back. But anyway, her parents remained in the house. And after a while, there were also relatives, cousins, and nephews that came and lived in the house also. So Johnson's prosperity continued. Then, somewhere at the beginning of the 17th century, there was an incident that happened. There was, there was a sailor that got ill and died. Why did the sailor got ill and died? He has been sailing across Europe for trade, and he became ill. He didn't take good care of his health, so when he arrived at home in Dublin, he died. However, the community over there, they used this as an allegation against the Johnson family. People began to accuse them of witchcraft and all those other things. Even though there was no evidence at all, the fact that there was a visible hurt amongst them, so a sailor that died, and already had this, this gray cloud of negative energy around them because of their violence against the Johnson household. So now that I won't say bubble, but all that negative energy combined, it exploded. And for the next 2 weeks, people from the Johnson household, they were viciously attacked, but not physically harassed. Stuff were thrown at them. They were avoided openly. And after 2 weeks, a violent mob, people broke into the house and massacred everyone. So what happened there? The community now, they acted out their rage against the Johnson household, and they were relieved from their pains because they finally could act out their pain. Both the young people that inherited the tensions from their grandparents and the children of those original perpetrators also, that knew Johnson since he was young, they all had their chance and they took their chance, so they were relieved. At least that's what they thought. At the time there was no police force operating in Dublin yet. Again, they were governed by the English kingdom. So there was no legal actions taken or executed against the perpetrators. But what happened? That negative energy, imagine it as this thick gray cloud that people had around them. After they massacred the family, all that negative energy remained in the house. In it. There were people afterwards that came and buried the bodies somewhere else, but that thick cloud remained over there. And that negative energy attracted malevolent entities. You can call them demons. Now the community over there, that part of Dublin, people just forgot what happened. Now, and literally they had forgotten what happened, that they massacred the whole family. There was one young man of 14 years old. He did not participate with the massacre, but after about 30 years, he could still remember what happened. When he had his own family of his own, he refused to be in contact with his relatives, because he noticed that his relatives were very bitter and angry people. He cut off all ties with them. So, that generation passed away. We go to the 19th century, the house was still there in Dublin when the massacre took place. That house still had that grey cloud of negative energy in it. And when some people passed by the house, they would sense, as if someone was looking at them, they would sense danger, they would even sense pain, and as if they're about to die. So people would sense some heaviness around the house. Now, in the 19th century, when Ireland was subjected to the Industrial Revolution, a new railway had to be built, and was to be built around the house. But then, at this time, the governor of Ireland decided that old house had to be demolished to build a new train station. And because the house was uninhabited for almost 80 years, because nobody wanted to reside in it, they demolished it. So now you would think, well, it's all well. Not exactly. They demolished the house and built a small train station. But that negative energy of what happened to that family in the beginning of the 17th century, it was still there. And those demons that inhabited the negative energy were still there also. And that negative energy attached itself to the new train station that was built. So now in the 19th century, let's go, for example, to 1895. I'm just picking up a date over here. You had a guy called Stephen. Stephen was an Irishman also. He was engaged, about to get married, and he was at that train station for a while. Now Stephen is not spiritually alert. He's not even aware of the spiritual realm. His fiancée, however, arrived at the railway station. She got off the train, and the moment she got off the train on the station, she sensed danger. She sensed as if her life was over. She began to experience some trauma. And Stephen asked her, what's going on there? Stephen, something's not right with this place. We need to get out of here as soon as possible. What's going on? What do they mean something is wrong? This is a new railway station. Man, look at all these people walking around. Stephen, we need to get out of here. Stephen, because he was so in love with his fiancée, he listened to her. But they remained in a small hotel near the railway station. They lodged over there until their wedding that would take place within 2 weeks. So they go further in time. They got married, and Stephen found a small apartment which was just across the railway station. And he and his wife moved in. Often, at night, people would experience paranormal activities around the railway station. And there were even people that went missing. And there were even people that committed suicide over there. And all of those sad occurrences increased it increased the negative energy. The grey cloud increased. So after 5 years, Stephen's wife had a miscarriage, and it was very sad news because they really hoped to have this son. But what Stephen's wife and Stephen were not aware of was that they were being affected by the negative energy around that railway station. Next year, the wife became pregnant again, and they had a son, and after that they had 4 more kids. And those kids were often around the railway station because they would pick up the train over there, and they would go further into Dublin or to other Irish towns. Stephen's kids began to misbehave. They began to act out violent often, and Stephen was asking himself, what's going on? I never spanked them. I never used violence against them, because Stephen himself was never spanked by his parents, and he never turned out disrespectful or violent at all. While he saw other kids being spanked, and those people had all kinds of anger issues. And Stephen realized, I don't have anger issues. I'm quite forgiving. I even attend church regularly. My wife also. What's going on with our kids? So Stephen goes to his pastor, and the pastor is a descendant of one of the perpetrators that killed the Johnson household back in the beginning of the 17th century. That's about almost 280 years ago. And that pastor, who's a descendant of those people, he experienced violence often within his own family. And it was later, when he became older, when he was in his 30s, that while he was at work at the municipality of Dublin, that he learned about a massacre that took place somewhere. over there, and he found out that the place where the massacre took place, that there's a railway station over there now. And he also found out that there were all kinds of suicides and bad things happening around there, and that many people were avoiding the railway station. There were even people that would walk a few miles. Let me use the European measures. They would walk a few kilometers just to avoid the railway station. And that pastor, that pastor also found out that one of the perpetrators was his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, who was a childhood friend of Mr. Johnson that was later massacred. So when the pastor found out, it all made sense to him why his family had so much issues. Because during, past 280 years, through the generations, the violence passed from one generation to the other. And the pastor listened to what Stephen was saying. Stephen and his wife came for counsel for their marriage, and they talked about where they lived. And the pastor asked, "You're living near that rail station, right?" They say, "Yes, we live." The pastor told them, "You need to get out of there, you and your children. Get away from there as soon as possible." Now, Stephen, even though he didn't like what the pastor said, because his wife put pressure on him, they moved. Stephen got a job in Wales, and the family moved to Wales. And they left, but here's the thing. The wife prayed for her children, and the children were delivered from that negative energy. So when they moved to Wales, the negative energy remained behind. The pastor himself, he did not have any kids. He also distanced himself from his relatives because of the violence that was upon them. So from the 9th century you go to 2016. We have a railway station over there that's abandoned. The railway station is there, but nobody comes over there. And it's basically a haunted place. It's abandoned, nobody visits it. And even the environment, the town has become a ghost town. The town is there, but you won't see anyone passing through it. And there were even plans because Ireland now is an independent republic, even though part of the European Union, they're not governed by the English government anymore. Some of the politicians in Dublin wanted to demolish the railway station and the whole small town over there. But they were told that they were told by the parliament they were not permitted to do it. So people just left it the way it was. And now 2016, you have a group of American graduate students that are celebrating their graduation, and they visit Ireland. And they hear of this ghost town near Dublin. So they are atheists, and so they think, well, spirits and those things don't exist. So they go to the ghost town. When they entered the ghost town, they remained over there. They had a good time. But when they left back to the United States of America, for the next years, they all experienced misfortune in their lives. They all became often victims of robberies. And after about 20 years, one of them looked back upon her life, and she noticed that till their graduation they hadn't experienced these things. And it was after they had their trip to Europe that all these things began. So let's call her Jessica. She is no atheist anymore. She's a born-again Christian. she's married also. She tells her husband about this railway station they visited, that they hung out. And the husband then decides to pray together with other people. And for almost a year, nothing seems to change. Things even became worse for the couple. But after that, relief came. This illustration I've just given to you has been a long illustration, I know. But I've took my time to fabricate this illustration to you, just to point something out to you. Violence has a spiritual root. And violence, let me say like this. I may have said it before in another video of mine. If you use violence to combat violence, you are increasing violence and it won't solve anything. Now, you can resist violence. For example, if you're walking down the street and someone is coming after you with a baseball bat, you're not expected to stand still and let them beat you and you end up in the hospital. No. Flee, run away, and if someone has jumped on you, just push them off, use force to bring yourself into safety. If there's a child molester that you see is touching your child, use force to get them out. Throw them out of your house or wherever, and if needed, fill in a report at the police of what happened. Look, you should resist violence, but you cannot combat violence with violence. You know why? Because violence is the expression, let me say this, violence is the expression of inner impoverishment. That's what it is. So there's darkness, negative energy over there. And just as in the illustration I gave to you, that negative energy, that gray cloud that was formed against Johnson during his youth, also till he was around 50 years old, that cloud grew and grew and grew, and it led to a massacre. But just because the victims died did not mean the violence ended. Through the generations, that because those people were not delivered, so they generated new negative energy, that negativity passed down to their children and to their children and to their children. And the hotspot where the massacre took place, it remained, the great cloud remained over there. So the violence did not die when the victims died. It did not even die off when the perpetrators died. It just lingered around, waiting to attach itself to someone else. And it did affect other people. So how do you combat violence? Look, I just made it plain to you. If there is a physical danger circumstance, you ought to use force to bring yourself and others into safety. And that ought to be done in wisdom. The reason I've made this illustration, because I want to point out the mistake Patrick Johnson made. When Johnson was 17 years old and he had his job at the harbor, he noticed that people were acting out weird against him. He just ignored it. That's the right thing. He should not have given in to it. If he did not give in to the dissatisfaction of those people. That's the right thing to do. But after a while, he noticed that the negativity was increasing. He ought to have left that place. He should have never built his house in that same environment. And that's the thing. Johnson was in bondage to that place. He was emotionally attached to that place. He just couldn't leave it behind. And this led to his early death of him, his wife, his children, and also many other relatives of him. And that also led to generations of that place being haunted, that house being haunted, and later when the railway station came, also led to the environment around the railway station to be haunted. What Johnson should have done was, after he got married, and he had a lot of money because he saved a lot of money off his work in the harbor, he should have, because there were opportunities for Irish people at the time to settle in Wales. There was a lot of farmland in Wales. He should have moved away. But he didn't do it. He wanted to remain in his comfort zone. And this remaining in his comfort zone led to much evil. Not only for him and his family, but also to generations afterwards. Stephen, that I mentioned before in the illustration, he was also victimized indirectly by the foolishness of Patrick Johnson. Now, Patrick Johnson he died in the beginning of the 17th century. He had no idea that 280 years later there would be some guy named Stephen living there with his wife and kids. He couldn't have known it, okay? He couldn't. Nevertheless, his decision to remain in bondage to that place, it indirectly affected Stephen that would have lived 280 years later. So what you do today, it affects generations coming after you. That does not mean that, look, even if you don't have kids yourself and your bloodline does not continue, it will affect generations after you. Now listen, Johnson was not responsible for people targeting him. Absolutely not. He was not responsible for it. Neither should he be blamed for it. Nevertheless, he should have been wiser in doing what's best for himself. Because here's the thing, when you lack in understanding, you lack in knowledge, you bring yourself in harm, and not only yourself, but also other people that maybe people that aren't even born yet, you will bring them harm. And not only that, Johnson's foolishness also led to those American students. America as a nation didn't even exist at the time. The colonies that would later turn into the United States were just founded. The whole concept of a nation called America didn't even come up in people's mind yet. But nevertheless, Johnson's foolishness also affected those graduate students that visited that environment later. And in this audio recording, I want to talk about intergenerational violence. Because often when people talk about generational curses, they talk about, for example, grandmother used to be a violent, narcissistic woman, and now all other females in that household that descend from her, they'll now have this narcissistic tendency. People tend to see, you see that's a generational curse. Okay, it is a generational curse, but often when people talk about generational curses, they look at symptoms and not at the cause. Another illustration I'm giving, why was grandmother narcissistic? Grandmother was afraid. Why? Because when she was little, when she was a child, her grandfather often used to sexually molest her. But she could never speak about it, so her emotional development went bad. And that grandfather, he was just a prick, a bully that was insecure, and he molested many people, include in his family, cousins, the wives of his brothers, of his siblings, and also his own children. So it didn't start with grandma, it started with the grandfather of grandma, and had to do with violence, and the violence continued till it came to grandma, and from grandma it affected the other women that descended from her. So when you talk about generational curses and intergenerational violence, because generational curses, that phrase is not used by the secular world, they use the term intergenerational violence. They use the term intergenerational violence because at least, even though they're secular and they don't acknowledge the spiritual, they at least understand that it has to do with violence. Look, when you are born again, when you become a believer, you are born again. that means that you don't belong to the world anymore. You're now born into the kingdom of God. But listen, just because you became born again, that does not automatically mean that you are delivered. So when you go through deliverance, when you are transformed by the renewing of your mind, because your mind needs to be renewed, when you renew your mind with the word, what happens is that in the beginning of your deliverance, you will face a lot of resistance. You will have people that suddenly will dislike you. You will have people that suddenly will look dirty at you. People that you used to be very friendly with, suddenly they begin to look dirty at you. They begin to be upset when they see you. And you begin to think, what's going on? At your job or in your family, all kinds of things are happening, even financially. You face a lot of resistance. What's going on? Because look, when you are delivered, you are not a part of that web of negative soul ties. Because a soul tie, because you, as a human, you are a spirit being with a soul living in a body, and whenever you have contact on the long term with people, you develop an emotional tie with them. And that emotional tie is like Wi-Fi. It's a connection that you can, let me say like this. If you have contact with a bartender regularly, a soul tie is established. And what happens when that bartender begins to think bad about you, because you are in a soul tie with him, that negative energy is going to affect you. Soul ties are established when people are emotionally engaged in something. Like if you go to a bar regularly to release yourself from pain by drinking things away, you develop an emotional tie with that place and the people over there. Or the easiest way to develop a soul, to form a soul tie is through sexual intercourse. But I'm not going to speak about that in this audio recording. Whenever there's a soul tie, it's like, they also call it energy cords in the occult. But I'm using soul tie here. Whenever there's a soul tie can be either positive or negative. Let me say like this. If someone you have a soul tie with, is talking behind your back and speaking bad about you, that negative vibration is going to affect you. And you may feel ill in your stomach, or in your belly, or in your hands. You are going to feel it. And why? Because the energy is transferred. So when you become born again, and when you are delivered, a lot of soul ties needs to be broken. And listen, there's nothing wrong with a soul tie. That's how human beings operate. That's how human beings form communities. That's how human beings are exchanging love, affection, and brotherhood. So there's nothing wrong with a soul tie. A soul tie is a natural occurrence, but soul ties can become detrimental. Soul ties can become, soul ties can become destructive when the people to whom you are connected to are negative laden. In that case, the soul ties, or energy cords as they call it in the occult, needs to be cut off. And when you are born again and you are agreeing with the words, that's what's happening. Those soul ties are being cut. And what happens is that beforehand, when you received negative energy that flowed through that soul tie, it just flew through you and passed through you to someone else. You were connected to a web, a matrix of soul ties. But now that you're not part of that matrix, that web anymore, whenever people are talking bad about you, it bounces back. It does not affect you anymore, it affects them. So now people are going to know that there's something about you, something they can't explain. And they also are noticing some positive change with you that they cannot explain. So now they're going to act out against you. And not only that, those demons that are attached to those people are also going to act out against you and resist you through those people. Those people are often even not aware that they have unclean spirits, but nevertheless, those people will act out against you because it's those evil spirits acting out through them. Just understand this. often it's when you become delivered that your eyes are going to open about the negativity that was around you all the time. Because before you became delivered, you may have been aware of symptoms, but you were not aware and you didn't notice the whole gray cloud that was hanging around. It's now that you're delivered that you are able to process reality as it is, that you are able to notice things as they are. Look, just about Johnson. If Johnson, I'm talking about the illustration I gave in the beginning of this recording. If Johnson would have been wise, he would have left that place and he would have repented and renewed his mind, and the violence would have remained with those people and the violence would not have grown like that. But because he remained over there, he had a right to be there. Don't get me wrong. He had a right to be there. But it wasn't wise for him to be there. Because the thing grew, later it became bigger and bigger. So, the first thing for you to do as a believer, you ought to agree with the word, and you ought to spiritually cut all those soul ties that are harmful to you. And it's not going to be easy. Some social contexts that people you used to be close with, you can't be close with them anymore. Because those people are going to destroy you without them being aware of it, because those unclean spirits through them are going to work through them to destroy you. So you have to let go of those people. Understand this. When someone when someone is born in the physical world, they are born, physically as a baby. If their parents or the relatives or the environment has some gray cloud of negative energy over there, that child is going to inherit that. And it's going to affect the child. And look, there are people out there that are often victimized people. Why? Because they have this victimization spirit with them. So wherever they go, that demon spirit is releasing this discomfort from them, and other people feel it, and people act out against the individual, thinking that it's the individual making them uncomfortable. Listen, if you notice that you are often victimized, now look, as a believer, you will be targeted, don't get me wrong. Okay? But if you notice that someone is repeatedly victimized wherever they go, they have a victimization demon with them. And this victimization demon has attached itself to that individual. Either when he or she was young, when they were vulnerable, there was one point of trauma that gave the demon access to that individual. So, again, don't combat violence with violence, or as scripture says, don't repay evil with evil, or overcome evil with good. Remain on the frequency of faith. And I've given this long illustration just for you to understand that you cannot judge a circumstance only by looking at the physical symptoms. You need to be in prayer, and sometimes you need to do historical research to find out what the root is. And sometimes you won't find out what the root is. Nevertheless, remain on the frequency of faith. So if you have people around you that don't like you, you have adversaries around you, those people are wrong for having this bitterness against you. They're wrong, absolutely. But listen, that violence they're acting out against you, it did not begin with them. It can be violence that started 200 or maybe 600 years ago, and it's now finding its outlet through them. Eventually, let me say what's happening. Violence is increasing and increasing on the earth, and it's going to manifest fully in the end times, and violence is going to destroy itself. And it's then that Jesus Christ returns just to forever establish his kingdom on the earth. So believers are called to patiently endure the playing out of violence, because violence has to play out for it to destroy itself once and for all. Are you supposed to agree with violence and permit yourself to be victimized? No. Just remain in faith and patiently endure. Remain on the frequency of faith. That's how you overcome. Be blessed.